I'm very, very happy to welcome Dr. Werner Distler today. Werner Distler is an assistant professor of international relations at the chair group Global IR and Humanitarian Action at the University of Groningen. And Werner's research focuses on knowledge and archives in international relations, on security governance, and on state formation in post-conflict and post-colonial settings. And Werner and I, we know each other, I think, for 10 years almost now, and because we worked at the same center in Marburg, at the Center for Conflict Studies, where Werner worked at the Collaborative Research Center Dynamics of Security, and has collected lots of experience with different kind of archival data there. And I'm very happy that he agreed today to give us some of the insights, and he brought some of the materials he worked with, but he also, I think, brought us some reflections and conceptualizations. So, I don't want to talk more. I give the floor to Werner now, and I think he will talk about like maybe half an hour or so, and then we open for questions and discussions, and afterwards you're all very happy to stay for a beer.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me for this presentation, and also as a guest here now at the Interact Center in July. So I really will try to make a methodological presentation as interesting as possible, and take you to the complex engagement with archives from an IR or peace and conflict studies point of view. So I hope that we, after the presentation, please feel free. I think that's important, very important to me. Let's go where it is difficult and problematic, also in the discussion. I think, especially in working with archives and with methods, and you will understand what I mean with that. I hope I can start the discussion a little bit, but please feel free to ask anything, and let us engage with the challenges, particular of archival research. Okay, so in November 2021, I was sitting in my office in Marburg, in the Bunsenstraße. I have some friends and colleagues who know this place exactly. There were 5 weeks left of my contract at that point, and I received another email from the National Archives of Australia, informing me about an access decision to a request that I made in summer 2019. So in summer 2019, I was visiting the National Archives in Australia, doing research on state building and state formation in the region, particularly Papua New Guinea. And I found a folder that I wanted to have a look in. I requested, in the folder, apparently nobody had opened this folder for 40 years. So I requested the access, and naive as I was, I thought maybe I will be lucky to receive a decision in the time while I was there in Australia. It took more than 2 years, and in this decision I brought it to you, and this struck me at this moment in my office. So the request was denied because there were some sensitive areas of interest for the Australian intelligence agencies in their relationship to Papua New Guinea. So years after I filed the request, a person in Australia, an official by the state, an archivist, took the time to then open up this folder, going through this folder page by page, and then found out that the international relations, or the relations between Australia and the government of Papua New Guinea, could be damaged by opening up this folder and giving access. Other parts of this this folder were opened to the public at that point. So I was just taking, my first reaction was, okay, this is another email of the Australian National Archive. I looked at it, it was interesting, and then I closed the email and I forgot about it for 1 or 2 days, but then it came back to my mind, it came back again, because I realized I don't have the time or the money left to go back, to open this folder, and to dig into the story, so the part that was public at that point, to engage with this, or even because you always can appeal the decision, you can ask again, you can ask for more information about this folder. So, because I didn't have the time, I just tried to raise it from my mind. But this was, for myself, a starting point of engaging more in depth with archival research. I was lucky to get another contract, so I could go on with my research. I was then lucky to even change from the University of Marburg, which the story took place, then to the University of Groningen. And I'm still engaged in this archival research, but so much came to my mind because of this story. So questions of access, questions of time, of our perception of research, right? The idea that I request access to something and then receive it years later. And still reflecting upon this strange space and time connections that somebody made this folder in the 70s, closed it, put it in the archive years later. Then I come along decades later, paid by German taxpayers' money, request this access. It is denied years later while I'm sitting in Marburg and don't care about it. So very, very strange and mixed feelings. So in the presentation today, I will start with I will try to jump between talking about state of the art and the discipline, and then also talk about the research itself. I will first talk a little bit about the historical IR rise and why we are now thinking about this kind of research much more, especially, and that is so interesting, a younger generation of researchers, often critical researchers, who are now engaging with archives, much more than maybe my generation or the generation before. And then I want to talk a little bit about what kind of archives and collections do we talk about actually when we talk about this kind of empirical work. Challenges of archival research coming from the interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary literature. As always, other disciplines are much further in the development than I are in thinking about something, in this case about archival research. Then I want to give you some examples from, so very concretely, how do we bring together sources and search for a pattern, for example. On my research in Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, and then I will end up with some reflections about what I call the archival research assemblage, which maybe can help us to think about archival research as a much more complex process. It's just somebody comes and opens up a folder and thinks about, and it finds data. If you have any pressing questions in between, just raise your hand. I'm very happy to have a little break or to engage with you.
I just thought I saw someone come in. I don't know. Maybe we open this door like 3 centimeters so that people know where we are. Sorry.
Okay, so of course, if you look into IR literature, you find that history is a part of that literature for a long time, but very specific forms of history. Everybody who's doing an introduction course of IR theories, but also peace and conflict theories, quickly realizes it's a very Western, a very Northern, a very liberal, a very white kind of literature and theorizing, and also the kind of history that is involved in that has the same character. In the last 2 decades, nonetheless, there we see an intensification of, or historical turn even, from very different angles to engage more with history in IR and in other fields or in subfields. And you can find a lot of terms for that. Historical IR, you have historical sociology IR, historical institutionalism, or global history meets IR, etc. And parallel, we find a lot of impulses from critical literature, which is rereading a lot of the first of the traditional understandings of history, and then rereading sources, and is engaging with archives and sources and collections again from a whole new point of view, focusing on what is missing or what was erased or silenced in the research and in the archives itself. Just some understanding or definitions, like, for example, global history. This is just one part of it. I don't want to throw all these terms at you, and also the debates about, it's quite fascinating, so from a philosophy of history point of view, can we see real patterns in history, or do we have a radical historicist point of view, which would then argue everything is so connected to the moment in time that we even cannot identify patterns if we look into history. But just some ideas. Global history, there are many approaches to global history. If you just look at the hermeneutic device, I find it extremely fascinating. In just declaring that, for example, this building here, the Free University, what we are doing is part of global history of knowledge production, for example. Something happens in the moment we just declare it. And you can see it here, even if you look into the not radical critical field of global history, very much awareness that global history can help with methodological nationalism. So, for example, taking the state, nation state as a central focus point, and Eurocentrism. So you see, there are many manifestations and approaches possible. However, and this is a quote from Zabrakol, because funny enough, she is, before the West in her book, much more critical about even archival methods. So the debate and the critical perspective, it doesn't end like, let's engage with the archive. She is very clearly arguing that also the fetishization of archival methods and micro-histories, which are, for example, approaches from other critical researchers, can reproduce Eurocentrism. So it's a constant discussion and debate about how exactly we are approaching history and methods. And also the archival research process itself. I really like this quote from Subotic, that there is, like, if we would have a conversation between researchers in IR, peaceful conflict studies, most of us would agree that it is a difficult process, but when you look into the logics of the archival research itself, what then happens, we think it is relatively straightforward. The researcher identifies the archives that may have sources useful for the project. She goes to the archive, reads the materials, makes copies, then uses them as evidence in a research project, which then ultimately gets published. So a very, very simplistic understanding of archival research, even in communities which consider themselves rather critical. But what kind of archives are we talking about, actually? And what kind of collections are we talking about, actually, in our research experience? So we find, obviously, when we think about an archive, you think of the National Archive in Australia, we have this highly structured and governed archives, public or private or library collections, where you have all this material found. But even there, and it goes over to archives and collections with a lesser level of coherence, you find a lot of unstructured material. Sometimes you get just a big folder or something that was never even opened before, as my case of the folder on security relations. You find archives and collections with like a medium level of coherence. I have friends who did research and found stuff in archives after decades. They were led to a room and some archivists said, yeah, over there, this stuff nobody ever looked into. So even in a rather structured archive, you can find this unstructured material, and then we come to hidden and counter archives and collections, which are often completely unstructured and or have been collected by individuals, researchers, for example. How do you approach oral archives, for example? And especially in peace and conflict studies and recent archives, we often engage with these kind of archives, and in all of them you have questions of access, ethics, is it a democratic space, how do you work with these materials, but it gets more and more complex when you approach this side of this image. And of course we have also very heterogeneous agents and actors involved, and also legal frameworks. This is also something we have to keep in mind when we think about this. And honestly, sometimes in my research experience I received, and I will start a project on that in fall in Groningen. We receive incredible amounts of data from people we interview, people we engage with in our research, and in the moment when we engage with them during field research, we don't even understand that as a collection or as an individual archive. You just don't realize it in that moment. So what are specific challenges which are, and I said it before, methodological literature obviously is dealing with these kind of aspects for a long time. So first of all, the realization that whatever you do, you engage with the state archive and you do your copies in the Australian archive or here in Berlin or wherever, or you are engaged with these individual, completely open collections that somebody gives you on a USB stick, and you realize you just received 20,000 PDF documents by somebody. However you approach it, when you come with your own research idea, you create actually an archive in the archive because you are focusing on specific documents. You retell the story of the folder. Even if you have a folder and you then communicate this folder with another folder, the way you make your decisions in extracting only particular forms of the documents and putting it into another folder and then use it for your article later, you create a new archive. And I think a lot of my colleagues would agree that basically on their drives, on their laptops, etc., there are many sub-archives, there are new archives that emerge and that have only like an access for one or two persons. So, can documents speak about practice actually? What do we see? How important is the context? So the study here is always underlining, like, we need research about the context because the documents itself only brings us so far. The coloniality of archives is a huge topic. So most of our archives could be understood as colonial archives. And that leads directly to the term displaced archives. So what has been destroyed, what has been deleted, what has been put somewhere to the back. Some of these displaced archives we can reconstruct. There's a lot going on in regard to indigenous archives, for example, that links also back to the oral collections that I mentioned before. But this is painstaking, detailed work and extremely complex to recreate these kind of archives and then also digitize it, etc., and make it accessible. Legal questions come in there again as well. Ethics in archival work, again, Subotić, this one text. If you work on violence, if you work on victims, you find description of violence, you find witness testimonies, you find testimonies of perpetrators. How can you approach this? How can you publish this kind of information even 50, 60, 70 years later? There's still a lot to be done regarding ethics and reflections. And then access to democratic spaces comes from the transitional justice field, where there is a rather positive understanding of, if we collect stories of victims, for example, if we have truth and reconciliation commissions, if we have museums and libraries and collections where people can memorialize violent past, these are new democratic spaces. In the moment we open up these spaces, preserve these spaces, something can happen for the present and also for the future. But always connected to these and much more dimensions, but I would talk too long if I would jump into this. And this is from the Nabucco text on life history. So her argument is that we create our own archives. Just some terms that we realize how complex these things are. Archival research is always fragmented through and through, and this is such an important realization, because you sit there and you have documents, document A, and you know there's document B, document C, you have document C, you find it a month later, and you will never find document B. You will never find it because it's not in the archive, it's lost, or it was put in some other archive, or you just have to fly back, your contract expires, so you will have to publish on document A and document C, and then you'll be honest that you don't have document B, or you're not, you will see. So, you know, you see, like, you can make this archive, you yourself create these connections, they themselves. Spatial discursive apparatus of experimentation, I really like this, because it helps us to demystify, or also like deconstruct the idea which Subotić made in the beginning, presented in the beginning. We have a problem, we need the material, we go somewhere, we open the folder, we make a picture of the evidence, and then we publish something. And basically it's much more of an experimentation. Okay, so some words on my experiences in archival research. On Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, part of a massive project, a collaborative research center. So 3 project phases, so we had a specific theoretical framework. We had a very broad question over several cases. My former colleague Julius is also here. He worked on Togoland under UN supervision, and we were looking into sources, mainly trying to identify data and evidence on violence, conflicts, threats, insecurity, etc. And the research led me to the UN archives in the United States, to Australia, as I mentioned before, the colonial archive through and through. Papua New Guinea, I was lucky to visit the university there, also the National Archive, and then adding also on and then adding field research in Timor-Leste, which is a very different case in comparison to Papua New Guinea. I just want to, because otherwise it's just, there is not enough context, please forgive me, it's just a minute. So we're talking about a society that experienced an intensification of European colonialism in the 19th century, and what we know today is Papua New Guinea was basically administered by Australia after the Second World War. One part of it as a true colony and the other part as a trust territory by the UN. So if we look into the political history of New Guinea, the trust territory of New Guinea, we have also the UN as an important actor. So one part of the research was trying to understand how political conflicts about separatist movements, secessionist movements, anti-colonial movements shaped the making of the state in Papua New Guinea. Micronationalists, etc., etc. So the idea was, how can we find, because it was a very much speech-focused research, theory, a framework, so where are the voices? What kind of voices can we find? What kind of tone do we find? And how can we bring these voices back together to the theoretical framework and then also to the case? So we have, in the case of Papua New Guinea, for example, a lot of UN documents, and I remember I started trying to understand how separatism was discussed towards so-called UN visiting missions in reports on the island of Bougainville. And this is an example, and I retrieved it in 2016 at this National Library of Australia, how, for example, a meeting between UN officials and separatist movements or politicians was framed. And you can see it's a very, very diplomatic language. I jump a little bit ahead. During the public meeting held at the headquarters of the de-colonial, the first speaker stated that the people of the region wanted early self-government. So this is the kind of language you can find, and you realize that something is going on, but obviously that's a very limited understanding of discourse. Days later or weeks later, I can't remember, I found another document extremely interesting where, like, you had internal comments by the mission and then comments by members. First, what was said to the missions at these meetings, then comments by the mission on the meetings, and then also like comments about the atmosphere of these meetings. And I was very happy about it. So some people were annoyed that the mission could not devote more time to meeting. This is something I was so glad to find, because you have some kind of political emotion in there. Then I looked above, and we are now in a couple of days earlier, in February 71, and then I read Alan refused to take part in a meeting with the mountain guns. Somebody subsequently shouted accusations, and I found it extremely interesting. So I tried to follow this other point of atmosphere that is mentioned here. And also in the same year, I found another document which used to be confidential, and it was exactly on this meeting, and the shouting and the accusations and the discussions about separatism. But I was extremely confused by this date. You can see there is a January date, 6th of January 71. The source itself gives a wonderful, detailed explanation from the official record to how problematic this meeting actually was, and that the UN diplomats refused to join a party rally, and there were accusations, etc., etc. And then I realized after a while, and it took me, the first time it took me days, and again for this presentation it took me again, that it was just the wrong date, and that's also the reason why it was underlined. It is actually a February date. So these kind of, just to give you an example of over weeks, and then I started of engaging with this kind of meeting, and then coming from the Bougainville situation to the Matangaon Association a couple of days before, where you trace through the archive these kind of voices. Then, how do you get, so these were only indirect voices. How do you get direct voices of members of this association that was so rowdy and crowded and critical with the visiting mission? And it took me years to get back, and it was in another project phase, and find minutes of the House of Assembly in Australia, obviously much later. This one is from 72, but to get statements like from Jan Kaputin, where we see clearly how critical the Matangaon Association was of the UN, of the Australian government, etc., etc. So trying to identify these kind of direct voices It was impossible in the archives itself, it was impossible in the UN documents, but I managed to do this then years later, following that trace in the minutes of the House of Assembly. I can have more time, right? Only 30 more minutes or something. I will be a little bit more quick with the case of Timor-Leste. So you had a first attempt of decolonization in 1975, Indonesian occupation, which is now in literature also understood as a colonial project until 1999. And then you had a referendum of independence and then a UN supervised period until 2002 or 2012. It depends on how you approach the mandates. The UN received an Indonesian retreat in 1999 with a lot of violence. So the focus in that project was to understand how security, political conflict and violence, specifically 1999, 2000, 2001, shaped again the state building or state formation process. In 2015, I was in New York and I did an interview with a former NGO worker who worked in Timor-Leste around 2010 to 2012. And we had a nice meeting. It was just a nice atmosphere. We met at his office at the university. He was at that time working at the university. And after the meeting, he sent me an email. Actually, Werner, I have a huge collection of stuff and I want to give it to you. Just all of my data. Maybe you have to be careful here and there, but you receive everything. And I had no idea the amount of sources he gave me. So what I mentioned before, this unstructured archives, I opened it up before this presentation. It is just crazy. I will never be able to deal with all this data. It is covering decades. I asked my student assistant at that time to structure it a little bit. I remember vividly she came back to me one day and said, like, actually there are pictures of dead people in there, a lot of pictures of dead people. It was very shocking. I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. I had no idea what to find. So coming to the ethics, care, even that can happen in research, in archival research. So just as I said, you find then kind of memorandums and documents and never be sure, I was never sure how official these documents were in according, like, regarding, like, could he actually have it legally? Could I actually read it? Could we actually use them? Some of these were very obviously confidential. You have like a lot of stories going on there. But obviously it's also extremely fascinating from a research point of view. I'm still thinking what's going on with these sources. And so just to also give you an example on how we deal with private collection as a source, and then create again our own archive with it, and we are dealing with this question of ethics and access, etc. Yeah, that's basically going to the same direction. So I want to finish with some reflections on what I call entering the archival research assemblage. So trying to bring this all together. So the reflection about sitting in an office one day, getting an email about access decisions, actual visiting places that are official archives, getting like a private archive of thousands of documents from a nice person in New York City, with disturbing pictures and confidential documents. Thinking about your own contract and realizing that you just won't be able to go back and opening up documents, for example. Tracing even days and events through material over years, so what I showed you before. And I really like this term of assemblage. This is from a work, from a volume on field research, and I think it can also help us understand dealing with archival research. So what do I mean with entering archival research assemblages. Obviously, I'm coming from a very privileged point of view of thinking about this over a couple of years. But it can you can approach it in small-scale research project, etc. So in this assemblage, there are materialities, spaces, agency, temporalities, and of course power involved in all of these dimensions. So you really have to think them, you have to put power in all of these elements. So if we think about archival research, it is not only the researcher and the material, it is not the researcher and the folder, it is much more. So we have financial possibilities, limitations, which will always affect archival research. If you now think about the very, very different financial possibilities of research in places all over the world, you will immediately also realize also financial possibilities and limitations of the archives themselves. So for example, the National Archive of P&G could not afford cooling the rooms, and you realize when you open up these materials and the paper, it is really crumbling. So the history is crumbling, their own history is crumbling in their hands because they don't have the financial means to preserve it. And who's giving the most money? The former colonial power. So Australia is digitizing all this stuff and has it all safe in their library collections. And these are development projects. So financial possibilities and limitations wherever you go, and maybe going to the spaces with it there and back again. I'm not only, I'm referring to obviously the traveling researcher, the material that is moved, but also everything that is involved with these travels, but also in the spaces that are back at the university. So for example, what happened to all my stuff? I took a lot of the data with me, of course, in copies. And the rest of the data is on our famous SFB ordner. But who is opening this? Will it be opened ever again? Or in 40 years maybe? Or it will be lost because it's on a drive? Agency. So we have to be, and this is something very important, and there's a lack in the literature of being a little bit more honest about it, I think, because there's a huge focus on the agency of the researcher now, how we can critically engage with archive and collections of data, but there's not so much of honest engagement with the limitations. As I said before, I received these informations a couple of weeks before my contract ended, and I will not do everything to go back to open this document in the Australian National Archives. I don't have time for that. It's also part of my past sometimes. An ability to react and also to be creative in finding ways, or just be willing to find ways of following traces of data, for example. And of course, the positionality as a researcher. We all, it's the same in field research. I would argue it's basically the same also in archival research. You don't necessarily, of course you engage less with people you do interviews with, but you engage with institutions, with archivists, etc. So where are you coming from? Who are you? And what does it mean for your research? Yeah, and of course the temporalities, that speaks again to project planning, research phases, finding objects and access, etc. So the past is the present is the past. I'm still fascinated by this idea that this one person opened up this folder and said, no, this Distler guy cannot read this because it will have negative consequences for our intelligence service on Papua New Guinea, while the document itself is 40 years old. So it's extremely interesting, obviously, what is in there. Yeah, this is a little bit what I argued right now. We need more awareness, and not only about ourselves in engagement with the material, but the process overall. I did not focus on this point of the threat of us turning into historians. I will leave this aside for now, because obviously we're coming from a theoretical, often from a theoretical point of interest. So I think awareness about this archival research assemblage, that's an important point to start. Thank you so much.